Once upon a time, free speech was seen as the foundation for democracy and a cornerstone of modern society. Today, free speech is increasingly being suppressed, especially by modern, democratic countries. France's arrest of Telegram's CEO and Brazil's ban of X are just two of many examples of the crackdown on free speech we've seen recently, and we all seem to know that many more crackdowns are coming. That's why today we're going to look at exactly why free speech is under attack, who is behind it, how they plan on shutting it down forever, and what we can do to stop them. Watch this video until the end because it might not be here the next time you check. Let's start with why free speech is under attack. The answer is because free speech is a weapon. In fact, it's the most powerful weapon there is. That's because speech can unite people and motivate them to act, namely when it involves solving a problem that people have been pressured to not even mention. Historically speaking, society's problems almost always have the same root cause: a small group of elite enriching themselves at the expense of others to the point that the others begin feeling the pinch. This enrichment comes in multiple forms, but the most obvious is the accumulation of money and assets. It's important to note that the tendency for society's elites to enrich themselves at the expense of others is part of our nature as humans. Every society starts out with an elite who enrich themselves to some extent. As time goes on, they enrich themselves more and more until they're actively taking from others. Eventually, people start to notice and they start to speak up. Now, the first to do this are typically put in prison or worse. But all this does is kick the can down the road. As the cost of the elite enriching themselves continues to climb, more people speak out without fear because there's less and less to lose. And when enough people speak out, a small percentage of them become brave enough to act. This small percentage then takes power away from the elite through peaceful or violent means. This small percentage then becomes the new elite. Then they start enriching themselves and the cycle begins again. Case in point, it takes just 3.5% of the population to topple a dictator, a statistic to remember these days. Now, this is where things get really interesting. You see, the cycle I just described doesn't happen in isolation. Contrary to the popular meme, we don't live in a society. We live in multiple societies. This means there are multiple groups of elites. And not only that, but each society is at a slightly different stage in the cycle. So, suppose there's one society where the elite have been enriching themselves, but not to the point that the average person has started noticing. Then suppose there's another society where the elite have been enriching themselves to the point that the average person has started to notice and isn't happy. I think you can see where this is going. If not, consider the following. The goal of every society's elite is to enrich themselves. However, this enrichment doesn't need to come just from their own populations. The elite from the first society can help destabilize the current elite in the second society and facilitate the rise of their next elite. Naturally, the next elite in the second society will be aligned with the elite from the first society, allowing that elite from the first society to also enrich themselves from the people of the second society. Now, what I've just described is something that has in fact happened dozens of times in recent decades. It's called regime change, and it's been done by big countries to small countries since the dawn of time. In short then, freedom of speech is under attack in modern democratic societies because it's being used as a weapon by the elites of emerging authoritarian societies to destabilize the elite of modern democratic societies. This is because many modern democratic societies are near the end of their cycles. To put it bluntly, the US and its allies are suppressing free speech because China and its allies are using free speech to show the citizens of the US and its allies that their elites have been enriching themselves at the expense of their citizens. Now, make no mistake, the Chinese elite and the elites of their allies are doing the same. Again, the difference is that the US and its allies are near the end of their cycles, whereas China and its allies appear to be somewhere in the middle. This makes sense when you realize that we've lived in a world dominated by the US and its allies for the last 100 years. Their elites are on their last legs. And by the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And while you're at it, share this video to help get the word out. Hey everyone, sorry to interrupt the video, but I just want to very quickly tell you about the Coin Bureau deals page. This is the place where we put together all the amazing deals and promos that we're able to offer you guys exclusively as viewers of this channel. Head on over and you will find such things as discounts on hardware wallets, some seriously impressive trading fee discounts on some of the best exchanges, as well as some frankly mind-boggling sign-up bonuses for some of those exchanges too. The link is down below. Check it out when you have a moment. Thank me later. And now, back to the video. Now, this ties in to who has been coordinating this attack on free speech. In case it wasn't clear enough, the answer is the US and its allies, or more accurately, the elites of the US and the elites of its allies. Both have been enriching themselves from their populations for a long time, and their people are not happy. This can be seen in everything from the rising levels of depression and suicide to the extreme political polarization emerging in most Western countries. Not surprisingly, the result is that more and more people in the West are starting to ask the question of why this is happening and who is to blame. From our perspective, this can be seen in the views on all our videos about entities like Blackrock and the World Economic Forum. These videos always get ridiculous amounts of views, and it's precisely because everyone wants to understand why the world seems to suck so much these days and who's responsible. And it's safe to say that nobody believes the official narrative anymore. In other words, everyone wants to identify the source of the problem so that they, or someone else, can come up with a solution. In case you forgot, the source of the problem is the current elite in the West. As we stressed in our video about the UN though, the solution could create a much bigger problem. That's because if Western elites were to be removed and their institutions dismantled, it would create an enormous power vacuum. This power vacuum would make it possible for more radical elements of the Western elite to take power, or for the Eastern elites to take control of the West. In practical terms, the former would involve doubling down on the status quo in the West, whereas the latter would involve the West basically becoming the second society in the example I gave earlier. This would mean people in the West effectively working to enrich the elites of Eastern societies. Now, this begs the question of what either of these scenarios would entail and whether there's a third option on the table. Well, let's start with the first scenario, which is where more radical elements of the Western elite take power. This is where the existing elite replace themselves with their protégés, their disciples. In this scenario, globalism would kick into hyperdrive with a combination of mass migration and mass automation. In theory, this would make things worse, as these elites would take even more from their citizens. In practice, though, radical Western elites would find ways to keep citizens content with things like universal basic income, or UBI. This is presumably why there's been so much discussion of AI and UBI in the West. More about that in the description. Moving on. Now, remember that the second scenario is the one where the Eastern elite install elites in the West that are aligned with Eastern interests. Whereas the interests of Western elites are globalist in nature, the interests of Eastern elites appear to be partially nationalist in nature, at least for the time being. In plain English, Eastern elites appear to be at least partially focused on policies that are beneficial for their citizens. Take China, for instance. Even though the economy is practically controlled by the Communist Party, the goal of the Communist Party is, paradoxically, to maximize profits for its citizens. Whether it's actually achieving this goal is up for debate. Remember that elites from every society like to enrich themselves at the expense of others. But one could argue that this goal is being achieved. China's GDP per capita has grown by almost 10x in 20 years. In the US, it's only grown by around 60%. If you want additional evidence, look at the Gini coefficient for both countries. For reference, the Gini coefficient measures wealth inequality in a country. As you can see, the charts for the US and China couldn't be more different. In the US, it's been gradually rising. In China, gradually falling. Greater equality in China, in other words. Notably, inequality in China could continue to fall if we get Western elites that that are aligned with Eastern interests. Inequality in the West would also fall, at least initially. That's because the first thing the new Western elites would do is take the money and assets from the previous elites and share them out. The caveat is that they would also share some of it, or even most of it, with the Eastern elites that ensured their rise. And over time, the Eastern elites would start to extract more and more value from Western peoples until they started to notice and get angry. The catch is that they won't be able to revolt very easily. That's simply because Eastern countries would have enough power to keep weaker Western countries suppressed, the way Western countries do with Eastern countries today. As you might have guessed, this would involve lots of regime change, only allowing Eastern-aligned leaders to rise in Western countries. So, the revolt against Eastern elites would have to come from the peoples living in Eastern countries. As with Western peoples today, Eastern peoples would be the last to feel the pain of the enrichment of their elites, assuming this scenario plays out. This means the revolt wouldn't happen for decades. Now, how does this relate to free speech, you ask? Well, you'll recall that free speech is a weapon that can be used to take down the elites of any given society. Regardless of which scenario we get, free speech will be suppressed whenever it's related to issues caused by the ruling elites, be they Western or Eastern. This relates to the third possible outcome of the power vacuum. It's the one that all of us see as the solution, and one that the radical Western elites and the Eastern-affiliated elites will promise us. That's to have a new group of elites who will create new institutions that serve the people and nobody else. Historically speaking, this is the least likely scenario. That's just because new elites tend to be propped up by previous elites or by foreign elites looking to enrich themselves using other societies. Without the support of either of these elites, it's very difficult to rise to power, to put it mildly. America seems to be the only country in recent history that managed to pull this off. It's easy to tell because the amendments to the United States Constitution are literally designed to ensure that elites which are propped up by previous elites or by foreign elites can be removed by American citizens. For those unfamiliar, the First Amendment of the Constitution ensures that Americans can not only speak freely, but assemble freely. As we've learned, speaking freely is the first step towards removing elites who have enriched themselves too much. Being able to assemble peacefully is the second step. The third step to removing elites who have enriched themselves too much is to use force, if necessary, which is where the Second Amendment comes in. The right to not only bear arms, but to form a militia to ensure the freedom of American citizens in the face of a tyrannical elite, be they foreign or domestic. Many have pointed out that the Second Amendment ultimately exists to protect the other amendments. We reckon we should point out that the fact that the First Amendment is about free speech and assembly proves that free speech is fundamentally more powerful than any firearm when it's used to unite people. The pen is truly mightier than the sword. This is probably why both radical Western elites and Eastern elites have implicitly and explicitly stated that they want to see the US Constitution gone. It's easy to forget that if one country has free speech and firearms, it becomes much harder to control all the other countries in today's interconnected world. In case you haven't noticed, political polarization in the US has got to the point that almost half of Americans believe that another civil war will happen in their lifetimes. Given everything we've discussed, there's a good chance this is by design. The Constitution is inconvenient for most of the world's elites. Now, to their credit, the radical Western elites and the Eastern elites have succeeded in convincing Americans that the greatest enemy is another American who doesn't share their political views. Fortunately, there have been many attempts to wake Americans up to this fact. Unfortunately, so far, they've all failed. And this pertains to another pressing question, and that's which of the three scenarios is the most likely to transpire. Will Western countries end up with more radical elites that double down on globalism? Will they end up with elites controlled by nationalistic Eastern elites? Or could they get a new group of elites? Well, believe it or not, but the answer could depend on the outcome of the US election this November. This is because of another weapon that's more powerful than any firearm, the US dollar. Countries around the world need US dollars to function, particularly those that need to import most of their natural resources. By this point, it should be clear that Donald Trump is not part of the current Western elite. Whether he's affiliated with Eastern interests is likewise up for debate. Many would argue that his hawkish rhetoric around China makes this very unlikely. Some would argue that actions speak louder than words. In any case, the apparent fact that Trump isn't on the same side of the current Western elite would explain why almost all of them are terrified of the prospect of another Trump presidency. You'll know this if you watched our summary of the World Economic Forum's summit in Davos. Fear of Trump was very real. This might have something to do with the fact that Trump has been just as hawkish about America's allies. Specifically, he's promised to impose tariffs on foreign goods. He's also been adamant about reducing or eliminating the financial support the US provides to various international organizations. If these words turn into actions, then the result would be fewer US dollars going to countries run by the current Western elite. Besides depriving these elites of some enrichment, it would also cause more economic issues, which would then increase the risk of uprisings that push them all out of power. In turn, this would increase the likelihood that a power vacuum forms in these Western countries, allowing Eastern interests to infiltrate them and install their own elites. The elephant in the room here is Europe. If Trump wins in November, then many European countries could succumb to Eastern influence. Conversely, Kamala Harris appears to be part of the current Western elite, and some would argue that she's one of the radicals. This is again up for debate, as it appears that the current Western elite are realizing that their radical successors are a bit too radical. Harris seems to be a true status quo candidate. As such, if Harris was to win in November, then the trend we've seen over the last 4 years would just continue. There would be much more funding allocated to elites in Western countries and organizations that keep expanding their globalist operations. There would also be more proxy wars with Eastern elites. Most importantly, Eastern elites would have a much harder time expanding their spheres of influence. That's because organizations affiliated with the current elites, like the IMF, would continue going around giving out US dollar loans to elites in developing countries in exchange for their allegiance to the West. The real question is what happens on the off chance that the US does descend into some kind of civil war. This seems possible regardless of who wins in November. Although there's been lots of chatter about a Trump loss triggering a civil war, it seems Western elites are the only ones with the incentive to start it. In case you missed it, that's because the US Constitution contains amendments that make it very difficult for Western elites and Eastern elites to enrich themselves to the extent that they desire. While both groups of elites are aligned in this regard, the Western elites are currently the most limited by it. Whatever the case, if a civil war was to break out in the US, it's almost impossible to know what would happen to the Constitution. With a bit of luck, one side would uphold its amendments and enshrine them back into law, assuming they win, which is not guaranteed. The current elites would want them to lose. What this means then is that the future of free speech in the US and globally could depend on what happens with the US Constitution in the coming years. If you think about it, the US Constitution is the main reason why free speech has been front and center in public discourse around the world recently. Were it not for the US Constitution, you wouldn't be watching this video. You would also have a harder time discussing the problems in your society, identifying the elites causing them, and planning solutions. That's why the elites will try to end the Constitution and why we need to make sure it doesn't happen. Looking at you, Americans, know your enemy. And that's all for today's video. So if you found it fascinating, smash that like button to let us know. If you want to get more content like this, then subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. If you want to inform someone about the fascinating nature of free speech, share this video with them. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Guy, signing off.